So I don't know who will be on here today, but I'm glad that you can join us. And if not, I will be recording everything. So like all the calls, you can find them on your dashboard. So today we're going to be talking about gut health in the modern world. You may have heard me talk about this before. So we're going to go through sort of the basics, the physiology, but I also want to sort of bring in more of our evolutionary biology and why we sort of crave the things we do, why we exist in the world the way we do now, and how we can adapt our evolutionary biology and history to eating well and thriving in our gut health in our modern world, because that's where a lot of us get screwed up, is this discongruency between our evolution, our biology, and then how things are now. Now we live in an era of abundance. We are never short on food. We're never short on calories, at least here in the Western world, a lot of us. I shouldn't speak for everybody, but it's a novel issue that a lot of people are dealing with. So I kind of want to address that today. If you have any questions at any time, pop them in the chat. I will try and pay attention to it. If not, maybe just go on your camera and give me a wave if I don't pay attention or anything. I'm happy to answer it. Or if you have anything that I didn't go over, you can go ahead and ask me after. So I am going to get started now. This will probably be together for about 45 minutes or so, hopefully not longer than that. But if you need to leave or anything, go for that. So I'm sharing my screen with you now. Gut health in the modern world. So like I said, today I'm talking about how our adaptation or maladaptations allow us to exist in the world with food now. So a lot of the time we hear like we should be all on an ancestral diet or a paleo diet or a keto diet or a Mediterranean diet. But that doesn't actually, there's no such thing as an ideal diet for everybody, regardless of what you might hear. Not everybody should be eating paleo. Not everybody should be eating keto. Not everyone should be vegan, vegetarian. Not everyone should be eating meat. It all depends really, yes, on your biology, yes, on your genetics, but also your culture, what you grew up with eating, what your microbiome and your immune system have evolved to eat, whether that be via your ethnicity, your genes, or your cultural upbringing. So I'll get into a little bit of how those interplay together. So yeah, essentially, we already kind of went through that. So the gut-brain connection is primal. So I want to quickly touch on how our brain and our gut and our nervous system communicate with each other via the vagus nerve, which you may, again, have heard me talk about before, because I absolutely love the vagus nerve. I think it's so fascinating in our biology and our evolution. And so it's really important to just take a note here. Oopsies. Okay, so our gut-brain connection. So the vagus nerve is the nerve that goes from our brains all the way down to our stomachs. It controls our parasympathetic nervous system, so the rest and digest system, the system that needs to be on essentially when we're digesting foods. And so proper digestion won't happen unless our vagus nerve is calm and complete and chill. So one of the best ways to actually activate this is before you eat anything, to sit down and take 5 belly breaths into your stomach. Again, this is something you hear me say a lot because it activates that parasympathetic nervous system. It gets the body ready to calm down and puts it into that mode of physiology where it's ready to digest food. So if we're in nature or ancestrally, if we're running around, if our cortisol levels are high, if we're stressed out, if we're chasing things, if we're trying to survive, that's not the best time to be sitting down and digesting food. Our bodies aren't really focused on that. They're focused on survival. So that is one aspect that has kind of bled into today. A lot of us have heard of the adverse effects of chronic stress, of being stressed out, of having an overactive nervous system bleed into other aspects of health. Food and digestion is no different. So in our gut health, we really want to notice this and being intentional about setting the stage and setting our nervous systems to be ready to prepare and digest food will help our metabolism work faster. It'll help us break down foods better. It'll help us absorb foods better. So really taking the time to honor that connection between the nervous system and the gut and to get that vagus nerve ready is a really underrated, and not really talked about aspect of digestion that I just want to preface. 20% of our immune system resides in the gut. So this is something called the gut-associated lymphatic tissue. It lives in the gut, and it's a huge piece of our immune system. It functions to develop our immune system when we're kids and we're babies, when we're growing up. It functions to identify toxins, parasites, bad foods, like everything we're putting into our body. Our immune system lives there. It's patrolling, it's making sure we're not taking in anything bad. So you can maybe start to see here where things start to go wrong with a lot of people who have allergies, whether that be anaphylactic or sensitivities. There's a huge piece of that will be activated depending on what you're eating, if you're allergic to something, if you're sensitive to something. And I'm going to go into the differences between those later. But just important to know that there is actually a functional piece of the immune system that lives in the gut. And actually, an interesting fact, that's kind of why we think the appendix evolved and why we still have it, because maybe traditionally, if you're like me, I was taught like there's no point to it, we can take it out. You might have heard of appendicitis before. It's quite common in the Western world where our appendix just gets inflamed, and a lot of the time it'll burst. We need to have surgery to take it out. And we've heard that it's kind of a vestigial organ, which essentially means it doesn't have any use anymore. But actually, go figure, there's a whole reason why it persisted in our biology for so long. And they're starting to hypothesize now that the appendix acts as kind of a reservoir for gut bacteria to hide in. So moving on to the next section, or the next slide here. I'm sorry if these slides are overlapping and kind of look weird, but you get the idea. I used to be technological, but I'm not anymore, and apparently I can't figure out how to do this. So hopefully you figure it out. But anyways, so the appendix and bacteria. So the microbiome, our gut bacteria, they live in our gut, they live in our colon. And they're a huge piece of how we exist in the world. I don't even think that we really understand yet how important our microbiome and our relationship with our gut bacteria are. We're just starting to, and you hear this and you see this in the realm of probiotics and importance of keeping your gut healthy, different strains for different things. But at the end of the day, we're just starting to understand this, and we are now acknowledging the fact that our gut bacteria, there's over millions of species, thousands of species in the gut. A lot of them aren't even colonized, so we're not able to recreate them. We don't know what they actually are. They just die before we have a chance to colonize them. And everybody has a completely different and unique makeup of gut bacteria. It's sort of like a fingerprint. Everybody's is unique, and these influence, like I said before, how we sort of show up in the world. They influence what we crave, what we eat, how our immune system develops, which again, I'll talk about a little bit later as we're children, as we're growing up. What our microbiome is doing and how it develops is a huge piece of how we kind of work in the future, or will be in the future. For example, eczema, atopic conditions, asthma, allergies, all have now been shown to be correlated with a defective or a less robust microbiome. So just to highlight the importance of the bacteria, and then going back to the piece about the appendix, is now that they think that the appendix actually acts as a little outpoaching reservoir for our bacterial microbiome, our natural bacteria, to kind of hide and repopulate if we get into cases of like famine or disease, or nowadays chronic antibiotic use, all of the things, or like diarrhea, things that will wipe out the microbiome and clean out the intestines. This is now thought to be a little safe haven for the microbiome or the bacteria to go hide. So maybe, in fact, removing it does have an effect. Again, this is something we're still learning. So yeah, it's complex, it's cool, it's interesting, and the appendix might actually be useful. So I'm going to run through the process of digestion here really quickly. I won't spend too much time on this. We all kind of hopefully remember this from biology, but digestion starts in the brain. Like I was talking about before, we need to be ready to receive food, to digest food. And this is a huge piece of, I think, disharmony now. A lot of us, again, we're not ready for food, we're rushing, and I'm guilty of this too. Eating is more for fuel. It's like grab and go. We're not maybe ready to eat. We don't prepare. We don't sit down and smell our food. We don't take the time to take deep breaths and get our nervous system ready to receive food. But this did evolve as a huge piece of our evolutionary relationship with food. So it's something that I think that myself and a lot of us could work on bringing back into our culture. And I'll talk about that as well. But digestion starts in the brain. When we smell things, when we see foods, we start salivating, our stomach acid starts churning. You might get the grumbles. That's your stomach essentially getting ready to digest food. Chewing your food starts in the mouth, obviously mechanical digestion, and then saliva contains an enzyme that helps us break down carbs, specifically carbs and sugar. Chewing is something that is not replicated anywhere else in the process of digestion. So again, it's something that we've kind of lost the ability to do, especially in our modern Western world, is to chew properly. We're kind of always focused on like the next bite and the speed, and we're in the car and this and that. So a lot of us are not chewing our food properly, and this leads to problems down the line because now you're having bigger chunks of food in your stomach. There's more effort your stomach has to use to actually digest things, has to churn more. It has to produce more acid to help break down some of the pieces that may have been may have been broken down if you were chewing. And this can lead to things like bloating. It can lead to things like heartburn because your stomach physically has to kind of like churn faster. Bloating because if you have bigger chunks of food that aren't being digested properly, they're going to sit in your stomach longer because your stomach or your body has to kind of work harder to digest it. And if you have essentially, it's kind of gross here, but rotting food sitting in your stomach longer, you're going to have bacteria ferment it longer, which creates more gas. So that's why you'll get bloating sometimes. That's why you'll get heartburn. A lot of this can just be remedied by sitting down, taking a few deep breaths, and chewing your food. So the most simple things can help with a lot of issues that we're facing in our modern world. So if you can do really anything to change your habits around eating, I would suggest doing that. Okay, so next food goes to the stomach. It's broken down via mechanical digestion and hydrochloric acid to break down proteins and stuff like that. It also works to sterilize microbes and anything else coming in. So we kind of understand that. The pancreas is also involved in digestion, secreting a bunch of enzymes that help break down fats, carbs, proteins, again, mostly fats here from the gallbladder and the liver. So we can have issues here when you see people that have problems with digesting fats. It's often an issue with the liver and the gallbladder. So if you do notice that, that's another quite common one in our society because we have such an abundance of fat in our diet now. So gallbladder issues and liver issues are quite prominent. Small intestine is where most of the food is absorbed. This is also where the immune system lives. And so if there's any issues here, or any issues with nutrient absorption, sorry. So if you see someone with like low iron or celiac, or they're not absorbing B vitamins, essentially, look for the small intestine. Obviously, that's kind of where most of the action is taking place in regards to that. Back to the microbiome too, I didn't really say, but the bacteria play a huge piece in actually digesting and breaking down foods too. So they produce different forms of B vitamins. They help cleave B12 from its factors. It helps absorb iron. They also help synthesize neurotransmitters. So 95% of the body's serotonin is actually made in the gut. And serotonin is also really important in motility of the gut, so you don't get constipated. So You can maybe, again, connect the dots that if you have issues or inflammation in the gut, if your microbiome is out of whack, out of balance, then it's going to also show up in your brain. It's going to show up in your mood. It's going to show up in your immune system. Again, weaving this piece into sort of everything and really emphasizing the importance of the gut microbiome. And then here, the end of the line, so the large intestine, the colon, where all the water is mostly absorbed. So this is kind of where that microbiome mostly lives, is in the large intestine, sorry. So here it's working to absorb those vitamins and cleave things, create those neurotransmitters and all of that stuff. Leaky gut. So this is something that if you've seen an ND before, or really if you're into alternative health, you've probably heard this term thrown around. And what is it exactly? So really quickly, as you can imagine, the gut lining is supposed to be tight. There's not supposed to be any holes. There's not supposed to be anything getting through. Everything that goes through the gut should be staying in the gut unless it's ready to be intentionally absorbed in the small or large intestine. What can happen is if we're eating foods that we're sensitive to, whether that be an allergy or a sensitivity, which again, I'll go into the differences next, but something that is irritating that immune system that lives in the gut, then the lining is going to get inflamed. So what that means is the immune system, the white blood cells, the red blood cells, everything is going to get aggravated, whether that's, again, you're eating an allergy, a toxin, something you're sensitive to. And the immune system is going to create inflammation. The white blood cells are going to go into the gut lining and create what's called essentially exactly that, a leaky gut. So the gut junctions that are supposed to be tight start to sort of leak apart, holes and proteins will start to come through. And these now you can see can go to different parts of the body, deposit in different places and do different things depending on what you're sensitive to or what your propensity is. So for me, for example, it will go to my skin. So it'll show up in eczema, rashes, itching, hives. Some people, it might go to their joints. Some people might have gut issues, constipation, diarrhea, mind fog, brain fog, all that kind of stuff is not immune. So that can show up with leaky gut. And it's so insidious and hard to tell because it's not very obvious. So it's not like an allergy. Again, like me, I'll use myself an example. You can see on the slide here, if I eat a peanut, I'm going to have a reaction, an IgE response. So this is an allergy. It's a little bit different than an intolerance. So I eat a peanut, an IgE part of the immune system gets activated and it's much faster. It's much more severe. It's a quick onset and then it's over potentially if the person survives, I guess, because what happens is immediate drop in blood pressure, throat will close, hives, inflammation. It's a massive release of histamine. And so that's an IgE allergy. That's a true allergy. If you hear the term food sensitivity, then that's actually a different pathway of the immune system called the IgG response. So you can actually have both of these going on at the same time. An IgG food sensitivity response is a little bit slower. It's mostly foods only. It's a different mechanism and it's less intense. So this stuff can show up again, like in your skin, in your joints, in your brain, whatever, but it can take up to 3 days to manifest. So something that I ate 3 days ago might be causing my eczema today. So both of these exist in the immune system in the gut and can react, but they're different responses. They can happen at the same time. And with IgG sensitivities, because they're not happening obviously, they're not so easy to track and tie. And a lot of us are walking around with food sensitivities nowadays that we may not be aware of. And over time, if you're eating more and more foods that are more and more inflammatory, alcohol, sugars, dairy, those are pretty much inflammatory for everyone, or you're just eating things that are triggering your own immune system, as you get leakier and leakier, more and more things are going to be able to go into the bloodstream, activate the inflammatory processes, and just create an abundance of inflammation all over the place. So this is why, if you're doing the 90-day program, you'll notice we're doing this too, is like the traditional elimination diet that most naturopathic doctors go through. And there is an intention and reason behind this. It's because we're actually trying to remove all those things that are inflammatory in the gut and allow the gut a chance, and the immune system in the gut a chance to sort of just chill out, heal itself up, and then repair. So quickly, I'll go through the steps, which we probably are aware of, but removing and replacing foods that are inflammatory is an obvious one. So we want to take the bad stuff out before we're able to replace and put the good stuff in. The most common food allergens nowadays: tree nuts, wheats, shellfish, eggs, soy, dairy, fish, peanuts. Those are the ones that most people seem to have a sensitivity to. So again, you may or may not be aware of it, but if we work together, and what we're doing now in the 90-day program is removing those foods to give your body a chance to heal. At the same time, we're repairing the gut lining using foods or supplements that are nourishing to the body. So things like cabbage, broccoli, collagens, different supplements, fennel, yams, all those kind of nourishing sort of soupy foods, things that are pre-digested, things that are high in nutrients, will help repair the gut lining. We want to repair the microbiome. So whether we're using a high quality probiotic or fermented foods, I usually recommend, usually with anything, I recommend getting nutrients and supplements from food, not from supplements, sorry. In the case of probiotics, sometimes I will actually recommend a supplement better than a fermented food. And the reason is this. So like I was saying before, all of us have a microbiome, a population of gut bacteria that's important, and everything is different, but every organism, every animal has a microbiome too, and every food also, obviously we can find it in stuff like kimchi, yogurts, stuff like that. But we want to find a strain of bacteria that we know can actually grow and sustain in the human gut microbiome. So again, there's thousands of strains we have no idea about, but having something like fermented foods or dairy, yogurts to use that to repopulate the microbiome will work transiently until we stop eating those foods, and then the bacteria will essentially just sort of die out because they're not native to the human digestive tract. If you intentionally get a supplement that has been grown with these human strains in mind, then the intention is that these strains will kind of persist and regrow in your gut after you stop taking this supplement. So it's more of a longer term fix. Probiotics are expensive, especially the good quality ones. So if that's not an option, eating foods that are fermented can be a really powerful way to sort of boost the gut integrity and just kind of give it a nudge and say, like, here's some help. So definitely that's an important tool to add in. And then the last step for healing the gut, reintroducing foods. So we'll do this at the very end. Usually I'll have people remove all of these inflammatory triggers for about 6 weeks is ideally what I like to see. So it's tough. I will acknowledge it's not an easy diet, especially if we're used to eating this SAD diet, a standard American diet. Switching to a different style of eating is difficult. So 6 weeks is an accomplishment. When that time comes, we bring back all those foods slowly and intentionally, and we test them one by one to see how our immune systems are reacting. If before we started, we had a really leaky gut and everything was sort of triggering it, now in this past 6 weeks, we're hoping that the gut's had a chance to sort of heal itself. And in that time, it might be less reactive as we start to bring things back in. And so then we get in a better idea of what foods we're actually sensitive to, and we'll actually start to connect that our brains and our ideas with how we're actually feeling. So bringing our physical body connection in is really important, because now we can pay attention to things we might be sensitive to how our food is interacting with our bodies and how we're affected by things we're eating, and then moving into more of an intuitive style eating, which I'm going to chat about now. Okay, so ancestral diets. You may have heard again, like, should I eat paleo? Should I eat keto? Should I eat Mediterranean? Avoiding grains because we never used to eat grains in caveman days. Things like this are really trendy right now. So what is the truth behind that? There's a lot of diets, like I was saying, and there's no one diet, I don't think, that's ideal for every human out there. We all evolved in very different places and very, very different cultures. And now we're starting to see the importance of our culture and our upbringing in our food choices, but we also see the importance of our DNA in our food choices. So if you're just studying like children that are adopted into a different culture, sometimes the DNA doesn't match up with their adopted culture. So for example, like using our sense of smell and just our innate knowing, we like if you smell sour milk or if you smell old meat or rotting fish or something, like that is a physiological thing. Our body was like, no, I don't want to eat that, there's no way in hell. And we know that, we like, our bodies are like, that's infected, that's going to make us really sick. And so this is really applicable for some things, and we still see it show up now. So like I just said, rotting foods and all that, our bodies and modern humans and ancestral humans are going to be like, no, that's not okay, that's not what I want to eat. But we also see differences between cultures in this. So if you, for example, they've sent, or they've shown, it was like a tribe in Africa. They showed them some cheese once, and this tribe is not eating dairy. Like, they're not a dairy eating tribe. Cheese is essentially rotting milk. So they took one look at it, they smelled it, and they're like, they almost vomited. Apparently, it was not something that they're used to eating, in their physiology told them no. So we see this in just like other cultures. A lot of cultures eat bugs now. A lot of in Asia, fermented fish sauce, or in Iceland, fermented shark liver. All of this stuff, some cultures might find delicious and others might completely be turned off on. And so this is another example of how our culture evolved and shaping our, yes, taste and preferences, but also this goes into another layer and will actually epigenetically change our DNA to be able to handle these foods differently. So culture and upbringing is really important to food. We also see like another disharmony, I think, is interesting between our evolution and our what is safe for us for things like paint, gas, acetone. Those things are all very poisonous and can kill people immediately. But they all smell really good for some reason to people. And those are things that's quite common. And then, like, why, it's a question, like, why would those things smell good for us if they would kill us instantly? And again, this is why we evolved that layer of culture, that layer of observation, because we will hopefully learn from our parents and ancestors, don't drink paint, don't drink gasoline, don't drink acetone. These things are going to be poisonous. But remembering that these things weren't necessarily around when we were evolving those senses as human beings. So we perhaps, as those senses evolved, we never really evolved an aversion to gasoline or to acetone, because those compounds didn't really exist back in our ancestral era. So I do suspect as we'll start to evolve more, we'll start to see more of that change as we see culture influencing our DNA. So flavors that are loved across all cultures: sweet and smooth, salty and crispy, and rich and succulent. So like sugars, fats, all of that kind of stuff. And you've probably heard this before. This is why it's such a modern problem in our society. Nowadays, we are surrounded by that. We've genetically and ancestrally like learned that sweet, salty, fatty foods are high in calories, and they were also quite rare when we were evolving. And so nowadays our biology pushes us towards wanting to crave and amass these high calorie, high rich foods, but they're always available. And so this is another discongruency where, back in the day, we would never have constant access to McDonald's or ice cream or cookies or flour or sugar or refined foods that we do now. And so when we did come across those high calorie foods, we would eat them. We would want to conserve our energy. We would want to take advantage of that. And now our biology still pushes us towards craving those foods, but we don't have this scarcity. And so we just grow, and leads to chronic disease. It leads to disharmonies in the microbiome, which are going to continue to crave those foods. So things like yeast. If we eat a lot of sugar, we could end up with a yeast overgrowth in our gut. These yeast want to eat more sugar. They want to keep growing. So they'll send a craving signal to your brain to eat more sugar. And so you'll crave more sugar. And so you'll eat more sugar to keep these little yeasties happy. But you might not even be consciously aware of what you're doing, but your gut is and your microbiome is. And so this is some of the reasons of how connecting and understanding what's actually going on will be important to overriding, again, kind of our neuroplasticity and our DNA, and just adapting it to a more fruitful life in the 21st century. So yeah, so salty, sweet, umami foods, as well as the abundance of them now, kind of is leading into an epidemic of obesity. Cooked versus raw. So I want to touch on this a little bit too, because raw diets, again, are gaining in popularity. Should we be cooking with our food? Should we be eating raw? We've been cooking with fire for over our ancestors for like millions of years. It allows us to detoxify our food, but it really allows us to get more nutrients out of our food. So primates and animals that are herbivores that are chewing, they have these flat teeth that are more suited to breaking down and to grinding plant materials. Humans have flat molars, and we also have carnivorous teeth, which is a clue that we were both omnivores that we were omnivores, herbivores and carnivores. We ate meat and plants. And if we only ate plants, it's really hard to get the right amount of nutrients. We would need to be chewing a lot more all the time. So I do think that using fire evolved into our style of cooking, into our style of eating. And and you may have heard, it's also a really important catalyst for our evolution, because now we're not spending all of our time chewing. We're not spending all of our time trying to just amass food. By having fire and being able to break down foods and get more nutrients out of our foods, we have more time. And since we're all doing this around one community fire, we're all cooking back in the day. We're all cooking together. We're all using this fire and we have more time. This is where we started to see community meals happening and sitting around, and the sharing of culture and the sharing of ideas. And this in part led to the evolution of culture and the evolution of humanity as a whole. So fire and cooking our food, it goes much more beyond fuel and just eating and getting more nutrients. It actually was a step way to evolution and community. Okay, so that's the wrong title, but what I was wanting to talk about here is what foods were naturally, like what did we evolve to eat, and what foods evolved alongside with us to eat. Because so things like grain, soy, wheat, those are domesticated products that we have in abundance nowadays, but that's completely of our own doing. Those were all like they weren't common grains by any means back in the day. There's a whole story about the domestication of wheat, which is really fascinating. But the stuff we have nowadays is not the same as what we had before. So the question about did we evolve eating grains? I think yes, we did, but not really the form of them that we have now. Nectar, fruits, and milk are actually the only foods that evolved with the intention of being eaten. So nectars and fruits were meant to sort of entice animals in and eat them, and then they would go around the forest or wherever and poop the seeds, and that would propagate the plant. Milk evolved as a nutritional food for mothers and babies, and is meant to stop being drank in, after you've been weaned. Essentially, persistence of digestion of milk into adulthood is not a natural thing. It's actually a mutation. So that's mostly found in like Scandinavian and European descents, but many other cultures are not able to tolerate milk, and we see this quite commonly. Again, this is another form of thing that is being evolved as we speak, because nowadays milk is much more common and it's much more accepted in our society. We have abilities to preserve it, pasteurize it, all of this stuff that we never never had back in the day. We didn't have this technology, so it's relatively new. If we continue to keep this in our diet, I suspect that we will eventually see some sort of adaptations, but milk and dairy is one of the most inflammatory things I see personally in people. I see it cause huge issues, regardless of what they are. So dairy is one of those things that I don't think is great for adult people after we've been, aside from breast milk when you're a child. Okay, so nectar, fruits, and milk were the only foods that evolved to actually be eaten. Other foods humans have sort of agriculturally grown alongside with and farmed and learned how to preserve these nutrients out of. So things like the combination of corn, beans, and squash, those are foods that were eaten by the Mesoamericans way back in the day, and they actually comprise, if you eat them all together, a complete protein. So all the proteins and amino acids that humans need to survive and thrive can be found in all of these ancient foods, all of the preparations that they've learned to extract them, like using stone to get corn, the B vitamins out of corn, fermenting, cooking, like cultures have figured out ways to adapt and get these proteins out of foods. Fishes and sea vegetables I think are another ancestral form of food that many of us evolved eating. We all evolved around coastal areas for the most part, and so fish, sea vegetables, sea foods are very found like commonly back into our evolutionary DNA and our phylogenetic tree. So those they can cause issues, of course, in some people. Fish is one of the most common allergens, again, whereas the discongruency, but for most people, they are genetically aligned, I guess. Fasting. So this is something I touched on before. We, as humans, like growing up, growing up in our evolutionary tree, humans, we never had abundance. We never had access to food all the time. And so fasting and it being in periods of scarcity is something that was built into how we function in this world. And so you may have heard recently, again, people are talking about the importance of fasting, the benefits of fasting, whether that be intermittent fasting or doing like a chunk of fasting, like 3 days a month or a week a year, or fasting every other day, or doing the 16-8 method, which means that you eat for the 8-hour window in the day. You're fasting for 16. There are different ways of doing this. And again, this is one of those things I think in the Western world, it's tough to put in a box, because back in our ancestral days, we never really had a schedule of like, okay, I'm going to eat at this time and I'm going to fast at this time. I'm going to eat these days. I'm going to fast at these days. Essentially, we ate when we had food. So we're still learning all about the science of fasting, but I think that it's really important. It's really powerful. There's tons of research out there showing the benefits of resetting your immune system, of resetting your gut, resetting your mind, your mood, your mental health, your microbiome. There's a lot of research about the benefits of fasting. That being said, it can be dangerous. It can be intense for a lot of people. So working with someone who's familiar with doing fasting would be important if you want to do an intense one, but research it and look into it. I think it's hugely beneficial. Okay, so tips for intuitive eating. Like I was saying, there's not an ideal diet out there for everybody. So how do I know what is the best diet for me? Again, should I be eating paleo? Should I be eating gluten-free? Should I be eating keto? And I always tell people here to really, what my goal is I want to coach people into understanding their own diet and their own food and their own connections with their food. So in part about doing an elimination diet and doing a diet diary, keeping track of what you're eating, keeping track of how you're feeling, keeping track of how these sensitivities or allergies might show up in your body will help you tune into the connections between your food and your diet, and maybe help you sort of thrive and exist in this world, because your diet is not everything. It's not the be all and end all, but your gut health is a huge piece of health. So it almost is. Okay, so tips for intuitive eating, I always say respect your cravings and your aversions. So if you're naturally inclined to want to eat a lot of proteins, you don't really want to eat grains a lot, I would say respect that, honor that, and listen to that. The one thing is if you're craving a lot of sugar, carbs, and stuff like that, you might want to look into, like I was saying, working with something to heal your gut. But in general, honor what your body is telling you. Pay special attention to when you are sick, or if after exercise, or if you're pregnant. Obviously, these are important intuitive knowings, and your body is telling you what it needs to repair itself, especially during these times. Look to your ethnicity. So second tip, look to your ethnicity about clues for your ancestral and traditional diet. So I mean, this kind of makes sense. If you're Asian, Asian people tend to be less intolerant to dairy. You won't find a lot of dairy in Asian cultures for this reason. They eat more fish, rice, things like that. Same with whatever culture. European cultures, they are traditionally eating more dairy, and so they'll see more meats, more heavy kind of foods. Whatever it is, these are good clues. Again, not a be all and end all. You're a different person than your ancestors were, but they can guide you and give you clues as to what might be optimal for your body. So look to your ancestry and your ethnicity. Tip 3, do not break food down to its rudimentary parts. So don't worry about proteins, fats, carbs. Food is so much more than that. I think it's a huge experience. And then also with the synergy of principles, we have a habit nowadays, especially in naturopathic medicine and anything, to take like a supplement, for example, to extract the activated compound, the medicinal thing, and then just use that only. But there's something to be said about this synergy of plants, animals, medicines being taken in their whole form together. This is how nature evolved. This is how we evolved. And then there have been shown to be different effects. Different compounds affect the efficacy of different other compounds, and then they'll act differently. And so eating foods in their whole forms is essentially what I'm trying to say, not just viewing food as fuel. Exposing children to a diverse range of foods and traditions, especially in accordance with their own cultures. So this will help, again, diversify that microbiome as we're developing, protect and robust and boost the immune system as it's developing, and also help your child connect with their identity, with their culture, with food, and building those good habits like we were talking about before, is sitting and connecting with your community and your food and appreciating the nourishment and the ritual of it. Very important things that many of us weren't taught, and is, I think, something that we are going to have to take responsibility to bring back into our population. Eating seasonally. So this one I think is really important. I'm going to go into that a little bit in a moment, but again, we evolved ancestrally in our domains, in our environmental areas, in our locations, but also eating seasonally. So what foods were available to be eaten during this time of year? And I think a lot of us are running on cycles, seasonal cycles that we may not be aware of. So some of the cycles we know of, for example, like a woman's menstrual cycle once a month, our sleep-wake cycle, those are ones we know. We're starting to see more as we learn more about our evolutionary history, cycles with the seasons, cycles with the agriculture, with farming, with our digestion, with our microbiome, which does actually fluctuate with the seasons, suggesting that we have the ability to digest certain foods better in certain seasons. Again, we're still learning more, but a good rule of thumb to follow, or a good assumption to make here, is that we evolved eating seasonal foods. And so this is a practice that we can bring into our days, our modern world now. And it's really interesting too, actually, Randy and we signed up for a CSA box, a community shared agriculture box, which is essentially in like March at the beginning of the season, you pay you pay a fee to the farmer, and they use that money to get their farm started, to get the crops going for that year. And then come June to October, farming season, the farm you'll get a share essentially of whatever that farm is producing. So it's a bit of a risk because there's, as always is a risk with farming. If you're giving them your money and there's a bad crop year, there's a storm, there's a freeze, whatever, you're sharing that abundance or that risk with your farmer. And so it's connecting you with your food, it's connecting you with the local sources, and you also learn to eat seasonally. You get exposed to a bunch of weird vegetables that maybe you've never seen before. You get to know what's growing in your area. So this is a really great option. It's called a CSA box, Community Shared Agriculture. You can find them in most every city. So that's one thing I would recommend. Shopping the edges of supermarkets is another good kind of life hack. Most of the sweet, salty, umami, refined foods live in the middle of the supermarket, in the middle aisles. So again, just shopping on the periphery will help you stick to those whole forms of foods. Yeah, essentially that fasting, again, I already touched on. Remembering that food is not just fuel, it's connection, it's community, it's evolution, it's growth, it's all of the above. And that might be a stretch, but it's really ingrained in our culture and it always has been. Okay, almost done here. I just want to touch on, it's fall, so I wanted to touch on that seasonal eating again. What does that mean for as we transition into fall? In traditional Chinese medicine, fall is the season of yin. So yin is a duality. It's thought of more as like the feminine aspect, and I say that in quotation marks because it's not like it has anything to do with women. It doesn't mean that it's like feminine. It's just a duality. It's an opposition to the yang element. So what that means is the yin, it tends to be more, it's about coming in, it's about nourishing, it's about creating, it's about being slow, it's about growth. So we see that as fall comes into winter, a lot of us intuitively want to come inwards. We focus more on being cozy. We want to eat more soups, more stews intuitively. And this is kind of what's evolved in Chinese medicine and seasonally. So we want to be eating more stews, more soups, more warm foods, more nourishing foods, more liquidy foods. It's the season of the spleen and lungs in Chinese medicine. So like we want to eat moist foods, and this is all very ancient tradition, ancient ideas, but moist foods and foods that are already pre-broken down. So things like stews and soups, like I said, will help preserve the gut. Sour foods are also known in Chinese medicine to eat. You want to eat a lot of sour foods in the body to help preserve yin and nourishment. So things like grapefruits, lemons, pickles, ferments. Again, this is all very general. Different people have different predispositions. So you might actually not want to be eating sour foods. If you're prone to yeast infections, or you're really phlegmy, or you find yourself just like, I know that sounds kind of gross, but if you're more moist already, then don't eat a lot of sour foods. Okay, and then eating for fall. So if you're, again, warming foods are good. This is the season of colds, of flus, of chills. So things like ginger, sweet potatoes, garlic, chili, cinnamon, all those kind of things that help warm the body are amazing to incorporate for fall. So soups, stews, warming foods, chilies, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's it. I appreciate you all listening and hanging out for so long. I'm gonna go over to the chat and just check in here if there's any questions. Jenna, I think you mentioned it, but probiotics, once you start taking them, you can't really stop. Okay, yeah, so that's kind of one way or one school of thought. So like I was talking about before, we're all born with this fingerprint, I guess, of our microbiome. Sometimes in some people, this fingerprint may be a little bit more like pathological, for lack of a better term. So for example, if you have a lot of skin stuff, atopic stuff, eczema, allergies, and asthma, like I mentioned before, those people tend to have had more of a history where their microbiome didn't develop properly or didn't develop ideally. So whether that be like a C-section birth, or if you were formula fed, those things always, or like if you were not exposed to children, or if you were raised in a really sanitary environment, like a lot of us are nowadays, then your microbiome may have evolved into a little bit of a dysbiotic state. And there has been research showing that kind of your microbiome is cemented. Once it's developed, it kind of stays within that range your whole life. So there are schools of thought that say, like, if you have that dysfunctional sort of picture, so if you are prone to things like eczema or whatever, or atopic disease, you might have to constantly be taking probiotics to kind of cover up that dysbiotic picture, potentially. Again, that's for a subset of people that may or may not have issues with their gut biome, if it's permanently out of balance or not. These are things we don't actually know yet, because we still don't have the technology to be able to colonize that, believe it or not. So we'll learn more. In terms of what I was talking before about getting a human-based strain, for the average person, the average Joe who doesn't have a dysbiotic, permanent, messed up gut bacteria, perhaps you had a weird bug, or you had diarrhea, or you went on antibiotics and it kind of wiped things out and made things a little bit off whack. No, the idea is not to be wanting to take probiotics all the time forever. It's to take those human grown strains in a high quality version that can then kind of root and recolonize the gut bacteria. So that's when it will be important to probably do a gut healing protocol and a few months of probiotic repair. And the idea is that the gut will eventually sort of recalibrate and rebalance itself back to baseline. So it all depends. It depends on your own microbiome and your own genetics. Certain strains and brands. So the brand that I like it's Genestra, HMF is the line, and I'm saying that because I'm pretty sure you can buy it off the counter at places like Palm or maybe Whole Foods, or like supplement stores. They're kind of known for their probiotics. I do like them, but there's lots of other brands out there. Soil-based probiotics are another popular option that are being used now, that are really showing some promise and interesting stuff. I don't actually know a whole lot about them. They're on my to-do list to learn more, but those can be good in people that are sensitive to probiotics. And there is research done about different strains doing different things. But again, it's one of those situations where, okay, maybe there's a lot of research behind L. rhamnosus, which there is a lot of research behind that strain, particularly for like skin stuff, for example. But is there a lot of research because it's helpful, or is it like known to be helpful because there's a lot of research behind it? We don't know. There's hundreds of thousands of strains of bacteria, like I was saying. We're aware of very few of them. So the best knowledge that I have now is to just stick with a reputable brand that we know of and look into soil-based probiotics. Difference between prebiotics and probiotics. Okay, that's a good question too. So prebiotics are things like garlic and ginger, or some of like the FODMAPs foods that you may have heard of before. These are things that break down into food. They're essentially food for probiotics. They're food for the microbiome, for the bacteria, hence the prebiotics. So the bacteria will ferment and feed on these prebiotics, and then like kind of grow based on those. Probiotics are actually replacing the bacteria themselves. So prebiotics can actually be a problem for some people if you have like what's called SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, where you have an overgrowth in the small bowel of pathogenic bacteria. If you give them food, the bad bacteria might grow and it might make things worse. So that can be a clue for what's going on in your body if you are reacting to a lot of prebiotics. Again, garlic and ginger are kind of like garlic and onions are like the hallmark. Kind of be aware if you get really bloated with those foods, you might have an issue of overgrowth. So that's the difference between that. Caroline, also in the same topic of microbials, do you have any comments about hydrocolon cleansing? Does that wipe out? Okay, yeah, this is another good question. And goat milk, okay. So colon cleansing, again, another hotly debated topic in the medical world. It can be beneficial, I think, if there's a lot of overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria, or if you need to sort of restart the bowel again, if there's been like chronic constipation issues. It has its place, I think. I don't think for, like, again, the average person to be going for colon hydrotherapy often is a necessary practice. Yes, it can wipe out the bacteria in the large bowel. Like you said, you're literally flushing things out. What it can also do is, if you're going often enough, if you're getting dependent on using on the colon hydrotherapy to sort of clean you out, that's another issue that I've seen quite commonly. I get that it feels nice, especially if you're a person with chronic constipation, to be clear and empty. It's a great idea in theory. It does have its place, but I think focusing more on getting that process going naturally is the place to be. That being said, like I said, it does have a place. Goat milk better than cow's milk for adults, potentially. Goat milk does seem to be less reactive for a lot of people, but it's still a dairy. It's still a non-native dairy to humans, so it can be an alternative, especially if you're used to eating that. But I don't think it's really an ideal option. There's so many different options nowadays for non-dairy milks, and I get that they're not always as good, but yeah, that's my opinion on goat milk. Same with like buffalo milk, sheep's milk. It can be an option, again, depending on everybody and your differences, but not my favorite option. Okay, does anybody have any other questions? Cool. Otherwise, if not, thank you so much for joining. I hope you learned a thing or two about your gut health, how to keep things healthy, how to keep things optimized, why we exist in the world like we do in terms of our gut health, and then also why we're doing some of the things we're doing, why we're doing an elimination diet. That's like the typical stereotypical thing to do, but the intention behind it, and really being able to connect our foods with our environment. If you don't have any other questions, I will see you next time. And if you do, just send me an email and I'll try and answer them. Thank you, everybody.